Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help you trust the products you depend on. And we should also include, you should trust the people who actually talk to you about the products that you should depend on and that you depend on. So that's what today's conversation is going to be about. As you know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about devices, consider cannabis, or obsess over pharmacy, this is the podcast for you. I do have to say I'm an attorney, so this is not legal advice. Both my guest and I are both pharmacists. This is not clinical advice. I do these podcasts because they're a lot of fun. I find myself learning something new each time. But it'd be great to know if you actually are listening. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. And you can always find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website, darshantalks.com. Our podcast today is going to be really interesting because we've had this guest multiple times. He's always a joy to have on. He's always super busy, so I'm always surprised that I can get him because he's always doing like all these different things. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things he's doing. So if you are in medical affairs, if you are trying to figure out should you be in medical affairs, let's listen in. You might find something new. You might find something to discuss. And our guest today, just to be clear, is the founder of ACMA. He can be reached out on LinkedIn. He's actually very, very accessible, surprisingly, because he's so busy. So he is very, very accessible, and I'll flash some links on how you can reach him as well as we continue. But our guest for today, William Solomon, how are you?
Hey, Darshan, how are you? Glad to be back.
Good. First of all, is it Solomon or Solomon?
Solomon.
It is. Okay, I got that right. I didn't trust my own instincts. Okay, good to know.
Yes, it is.
So let me ask you this question. You've been really busy. We've had these conversations rather recently. The last time we spoke, you were actually going to the Attorney General's offices. You were talking to them. I don't know if you're free to talk about what are they often looking for and why do they reach out to you for something like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think the last time we were meeting, I was about to go down to the U.S. Attorney General's Alliance meeting. And so, one of the big things, unfortunately, in the U.S. over the last 2 years, that's been a major concern for the U.S. government, the federal and the state level, has been the opioid crisis. And you may have seen, I've done a lot of different television shows like Fox News and others to talk about this issue. It's a real big problem in the U.S. It's actually had been a big burden on the healthcare system cost-wise. And so I was invited by the U.S. Attorney General's Alliance to talk about the importance of establishing standards for the professionals that work in the pharmaceutical industry. Specifically, we're very focused, of course, on medical affairs and medical science liaison professionals. And as you know, that's what we do. That's kind of our bread and butter at the ACMA, is what we focus on. So I was very honored to be invited there. I got to meet a lot of cool people, and it was really interesting, because the government, they're very much aware of what the role the MSL is in terms of engaging doctors and how impactful they can be. So I always tell folks that I talk to in the industry, it's really very important, actually, now more than ever, to consider independently certifying and accrediting your team, because it's really a way to mitigate risk, and it's a way to ensure that you kind of cross the T's and dot the I's in the event, God forbid, you're under an audit or something. You can say, look, we actually ensured that our medical team is meeting certain kind of minimum standards. And so that's what I was invited to talk about, and they were very receptive, very interested, and we're still having those conversations.
So you're having these conversations when you're talking to these attorney generals, and you're talking to them about the value. What is the pushback you get? Do they see industry and just paint you in the same light as everyone else, or do they even, first of all, let's start from the beginning. Do they think that industry is primarily full of bad actors? Let me ask you that question. Or because they only see the worst parts of the worst, right? So how does that work?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the opioid crisis, the industry did play somewhat of a role. We can't deny that. No, I don't think they see the industry as full of bad actors, but they recognize that the industry could do a better job in how they characterize information they give to physicians. I think where there was confusion is that there was maybe not initially, I would say 2-3 years ago, we were first having these conversations. And by the way, not just with attorney generals, even on the Hill, in Congress, we were having a lot of conversations. The difference between a sales rep and an MSL. People conflate those two, right? And even till now, you still have a lot of healthcare providers that don't necessarily understand the difference. And this is why I'm a big believer in professionalizing our profession as a medical affairs professional or an MSL. And I'm against separating the MSL from a medical affairs professional in general. To me, the medical affairs functions all one unit. Of course, the MSLs and field medicals sit within that. And this is why, even when the board certification in medical affairs was first conceived over 6 years ago, the thought was that it really should be a comprehensive program that really oversaw the whole function, because the whole function is really one organism or one unit that does one of two things. You're either generating data or you're communicating data, right? If it's a MedInfo call center, or if it's a field medical, or you're generating data if you are, working in medical strategy or doing HEOR. So it's primarily, those are the primary two functions. And so I'm a big proponent of that. And I actually believe that some of the organizations out there that try to separate out these particular functions, I'm against that. And I know that that's controversial, but I'm against it because I actually think it fragments medical affairs. We really need to professionalize
just
that.
To clarify, when you say you separating the two functions, are you talking about HEOR and MSLs, or are you talking about sales and MSLs?
I'm talking about medical affairs as a whole and MSLs. A lot of times we in the industry, we separate those two, but they're really the same thing. MSLs are just an extension of field medical. It's not really separate. And that's something that I think is a disservice actually to the MSLs and to internal medical. It's actually one, that's why I said before, it's one unit or one organism. And I know that there's some organizations out there that focus specifically on MSLs, but I think that's a disservice because really the MSLs, for them to be integrated properly, really have to see them as part of the entire medical affairs organization.
So let's start from the beginning, because I actually have a friend who is a pharmacist, and I actually had this conversation with her more than a few times. She is a little tired of being a clinical pharmacist in the hospital. And I was like, well, what else are you considering? And she's like, well, I thought about industry. And I said, so have you considered being an MSL? The two things she mentioned was, well, I don't really want to be a glorified salesperson. That's basically what her initial thought was, which really speaks to exactly what you were discussing a few seconds ago. Right. And the second thing she worried about is, will I have time for my family at that point? So I guess my question for you is, as someone who is helping with the certification and in many ways driving the field forward to really talk about what is possible in this role, do you have conversations right now about, for people who are starting out, is this the right fit for them? How do you even begin to guide them through that thought process? That's
a really good question. We actually had a few months ago, we had a blog actually that actually discussed that. Are you being an MSL? Are you going into the industry for the right reason? I think a lot of times it's more that they're running away from something they don't like, right? Versus going to something that they really understand. I completely get where you're coming from. And it's actually, like I said, it's a very good question, because oftentimes they're sick of working in clinical or sick of retail. And so they look towards an MSL role because they might think it has better work-life balance. I get to work from home and I have more flexibility and all that kind of stuff. And yes, there is an element of that, certainly, right? There isn't maybe that level of rigidity that you find in a role like a retail pharmacy type role. But the point here is that even when you work as an MSL, it's a kind of a trade-off. So while you may not be, in a pharmacy or in a hospital and working maybe at an hourly basis, there's quite a bit of travel. There's a lot of demand, from multiple stakeholders: sales, clinical, internal medical, your KOLs, and that that's also pressure. you have an element of business acumen that involves relationship building, and not everybody likes that. Not everybody likes that schmoozing part. We don't talk about that a lot in medical affairs, the MSL world, but not everybody likes that. So my wife, who is a pharmacist, and she's the founder of Pharmacist Moms. You might have heard of Pharmacist Moms. And I met her when she was in MSL, right? We were both MSLs. And she hated that schmoozing part. She was not good at it. And I liked it. I enjoyed going to KOLs and building that relationship and taking them out to dinner, right? So it's not for everybody. And I think sometimes where people run into when they get into that role is they discount that part. But that part is actually a very important part to be successful, because at the end of the day, when you're going to meet with a KOL, it's not just about bringing the data. Of course, they want that data. They want that information. It's also about, they have to like you. They have to like to want to meet you, right? They're taking time out of their day. Remember, reimbursements are lower right now for physicians. They have to see more patients, especially those practicing physicians. And so when they're taking time out of their day, they've got to enjoy sitting with you. And so that's an important part of it. And I think those are all things that people need to recognize that the relationship part is important.
So I'm going to say this. We just have a comment come in from Janan. I'm a pharmacy career coach, and these are truly insightful comments about the field. MSL is often a glorified role people seek because they value that working from home element you mentioned. What I think is interesting, Janan, is the fact that William's saying the working from home is not as much from home as most people think. And I think this conversation is important, and it's outlining exactly that piece of the job that people don't often recognize. And I wonder, and I don't know if you know the statistics around this, but do you know how many people change jobs out of being an MSL once they realize this is a core component, that yes, you work from home, but you travel a lot?
That's a good question. I don't know how many leave, but I know that the average tenure is about 2 years, from one company to the next. And it's always, I always tell people it's a bad sign. Even when I hire people at the ACMA, if I ask someone, why do you want to leave your current role? And someone says, well, they decided to put us back in the office and I want to work from home. That's not a good enough reason, right? Because, we enjoy working from home, but that can't be the major driving factor, right? For why you can't be in that. That's one of the factors. It can be the whole thing.
Well, you say that though, but for the last 2 years, isn't that what we just did? Do you think that the role of the MSL is going to change because COVID forced us to change, in the sense that people are now engaging and it seems to work to a certain extent?
I think to some extent it's going to change, but I think what a lot of companies are realizing is that face-to-face human interaction is very important. It's not the same as when you meet someone in person versus just doing it virtually. Yes, there's some things you can do to get the job done, but there is value there to meeting in person. That being said, a lot of your doctors today are millennials. And the millennial doctors today, they're used to this idea of being able to meet someone virtual, get the information they need in a different way, and they're probably going to be more accepting of that idea. So I do think there's going to be somewhat of a shift, but I still think we're always going to value face-to-face interaction. We see that happening now. A lot of the conferences are coming back now in person. The ACMA, for example, we're going to be at Mass up next month, so my team will be there, and that's an in-person meeting. And why is it important for us to be there? Because we believe, being face-to-face with folks and meeting them, that's key to building that relationship. So first of all, we have a follow-up from Janan where she goes, I'm glad we're discussing how much travel is necessary and the need to be an extrovert and schmoozing there is. I guess my question is it necessarily a need to be an extrovert, or is it is it reveling in what you already know? So what's your take on that? I don't know if it's necessarily being an extrovert. I don't consider myself an extrovert, but I I've practiced over the years how to build those relationships. There's a way to do it. So it's not that you have to be an extrovert, but it's that you need to be comfortable getting to know people and building relationships and sharing information with people you may not know very well, and having that level of assertiveness. And it's not just a data dump, and that's, you hear a lot in the MSL world. It's not about going in and just dumping data. It's really going in and getting to know them, getting to understand their needs and how you can help them. That's the key, is how do you bring value and better inform their clinical decisions, right? I mean, if you're a good MSL, in my opinion, you're really going in there and making sure that you're providing information to help them make better clinical decisions. Ultimately, that's the idea, right? And helping to figure out and find ways that you can create a bridge between them and your company, whether it's studies and research, advisory boards, consultancy, whatever that is, all those typical things that MSLs do.
So it's funny you talk about that, because the key component of being an MSL in many ways is what you keep describing as this relationship building. However, when I think of the DOJ, I think about FDA. And FDA, again, to a certain extent, doesn't even have jurisdiction over MSLs, but that's a very different discussion. The point I'm making, though, is a lot of these governmental bodies are really coming at this with this idea that it should be transactional. You're doing the work. You're helping them make a decision. You're not the one making the decision, and you do that, move out. But that sort of ignores the human element, as I see it. The human element being you have to develop trust. And that trust comes from continuous engagement. But that continuous engagement, I guess, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of doing a soapbox thing, but that continuous engagement starts seeping into the whole direction of, are you now being salesy? So how do you guide MSLs in saying, here's how you can build trust, here's how you avoid being salesy, and how do you sort of help them navigate that?
Well, see, that goes back to the credibility piece. And that's why I think professionalizing what we do through some type of credential to distinguish us from sales is important, because being salesy, the idea of being salesy, what are we actually talking about? When we say, you're being salesy, does that mean that I am being a schmoozer? Does that mean I'm trying to engage you and trying to build a relationship? I don't see it that way. I see it that talent or that skill is important in many different roles. You can even argue a physician. A good physician knows how to build relationships, or knows how to build relationships with his or her patients, right? Because that's part of it, right? And you go online, you read some of those reviews that doctors have. So a lot of times it's that patients feel like, wow, this doctor doesn't give me that warm and fuzzy feeling. They're not, sociable. They're not likable. They're not approachable. So this idea that being engaging or schmoozing or building those relationships means you're salesy, I totally reject that. I think it's about your competency. If you have the right competencies and you provide information in an objective and reliable way, you know what you're talking about, then that will come, because then I know I can trust you. Because when I was in pharma and I used to lead MSL teams, I saw it firsthand. If the MSL was credible and they knew how to present the data properly, they knew how to answer in-depth questions correctly and accurately, the doctors trusted them. So a big part of that was you have to know what you're doing. I saw people that were very good schmoozers and could build relationships but didn't have the science, and that didn't matter, right? They couldn't get in the next time. They had a difficult time accessing doctors because they can't bring the value. So it's two, both of them work hand in hand. Both components are important. It can't be that you have one and not the other. So that I think is something you can't discount.
It's really interesting. So what I hear you saying is that the first step to trust with clinicians is credibility. Is that fair?
Credibility through your ability to be able to communicate and know the science accurately and objectively. And that's what's going to distinguish you from sales. because sales isn't going in and doing that, right? They're saying, hey, Darshan, I'm happy to be here. I'm going to show you it's a 30% increase here, 20%, and then sign here. That's very different than what an MSL does. So that's the key number. That's the kind of the cornerstone. Then, of course, the relationship building, that's required to keep that going, to keep being able to find those areas for kind of, a commonality for your company and help to provide opportunities for collaboration.
Which I think is really interesting. So what you have essentially is a formula. Your formula is credibility plus relationship building equals trust. Is that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not saying that it's earth-shattering, right? I mean, this is in any profession. I'll tell you a funny story. One time, a patient told me they went into a doctor's office and they asked the doctor a question. The doctor literally in the office turned around, took out their phone, and Googled the question. You think that patient thinks that doctor's credible? I'm not.
But so wait. We've got credibility plus what did I just say? Plus relationship building. But I guess my question, one thing that's missing, and I'd be curious what your opinion on this is it credibility plus relationship building plus consistency? And what I mean by that is, how often should an MSL meet with a doctor, with the or whoever else in healthcare to build that relationship? Is it, as we just said, transactional, and like the first time you come in with your PhD, PharmD, MD credentials, and you go, I know what I'm talking about. I was leading Harvard and in whatever, and this is here are my credentials, and you can trust me? Or is it, Dr. Smith, let me talk to you about your daughter, let me talk to you about your patients, let me talk, build that relationship and then disappear? Or do you need to come in every quarter, come in every 6 months and have that conversation all over again? What do you recommend as you develop that?
I mean, consistency is absolutely important. You have to be able to go in there on a routine basis. The frequency depends really on the doctor, and it depends a lot of times on your territory and the need. You're going to find that if you have a big territory, your frequency might be very different than if you were in an MSL in Manhattan. I used to be an MSL in Manhattan, and my frequency was higher, for each doctor, because I can get to them much more quickly. But if I had a big territory, which I used to cover the Mid-Atlantic, this is now going 20 years ago. And in that situation, I couldn't maybe get to every doctor as much as I wanted to. So you have to gauge the situation and the need. But I would say, a general rule of thumb is, once a quarter is probably reasonable. If you can get to each KOL once a quarter in person, that's great. I would say following up though with your KOLs, at least by email once a month, is important, and providing some type of information. So at least they remember who you are. Because remember, you're not the only game in town, right? You have other MSLs that also have that therapeutic area, and they're also reaching out. So continuing to follow up with information that they see as valuable, even just by email, is important.
See, now that's an interesting question to me, because you're saying there's other game in town. You need to be front of mind. It helps you build credibility, all of which is critical, all of which is important. But why does it matter if there's other game in town? You're not trying to sell. You're just trying to build a relationship. Does it matter that this clinician's building relationships with others? It's not like trust gets diluted. So what is your thought process? Why is that important?
Because it's a matter of share of voice. And so even within science, there's still share of voice, because let's be honest. Let's say I'm an MSL in the area of diabetes, and you're an MSL in the area of diabetes with another company, and we both have a product. Yes, we're not selling the product, but there is a point of view that we are trying to talk about or communicate. We want you to understand our point of view. You see what I mean? So let's not kid ourselves in that MSLs don't sell, but MSLs, including all of medical affairs, their activity helps to provide the context and the foundation for good selling, right? Because I mean, think about it. If you're in medical affairs and you decide, you come up with a great pathway for expanding the label, and now this new indication is now on the label. So now, once it's on the label, now a sales rep can go out and talk about it proactively, right? Once they have the assets. So what you've done in effect is created a more effective context for selling more effectively. So, I think this idea that MSLs don't sell doesn't negate the fact that medical creates a good context for selling, as does regulatory. I used to be on the MLR review meetings, medical legal review, committee, regulatory meetings where we're reviewing commercials, we're reviewing tweets. Now you can argue, why is medical involved in that? Why is regulatory involved in that? Well, because even though it's a direct-to-consumer commercial, regulatory and medical need to be involved to make sure that the information is objective, it's accurate, it's in the line from a regulatory perspective, right, with the FDA labeling. But that ultimately helps to sell the drug, but it's doing it in an ethical, of course, and a compliant way. So you can't divorce the two. And again, that's why I keep saying this. That's why, because of these questions you're asking, it's to me, it's indicative of the fact that we know in the industry there's a blurred line sometimes. And that's why we need to professionalize what we do. I can't stress that enough. And there's still, I'm going to say this, and I know it's controversial, and I apologize, but there's still a lot of old-timer folks that have been in the industry, and I'm one of the old-timer folks, but there's still a lot of folks that have been in the industry for 20 and 30 years that don't want to accept this change, that, like you said, where we need to move the industry forward. Let's move it forward. What are we afraid of? Let's move it forward and do it the right way. Because we don't know everything. We just don't. I've talked to people that have been in the industry for 19, 20 years. They get board certified and they'll reach out to us and say, wow, I didn't realize how much I didn't know. Because we don't know everything. We're exposed.
So I can obviously keep going for a very, very long time, but as you know, I try to wrap it up a little bit just to give us a little bit of time. This has been absolutely fascinating. But a couple of questions for you. So the first question, based on what we discussed, what would you like to ask the listeners?
What I'd like to ask the listeners, I'd love to know if a lot of the listeners that are out there watching, if they recognize that MSLs are part of medical affairs, because it's always surprising to me when people reach out and they actually don't realize that the MSL is part of medical affairs.
Oh, interesting. I mean, yeah. I knew it was, but I'd always assumed everyone else did too. But you're right. I was making an assumption. So very, very cool. I'll try to put that up as a LinkedIn survey and just see what happens.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see.
The second question for you. What is something interesting you've learned over the last month?
Something interesting that I've learned over the last month. I would say probably, like we were talking about earlier with some of the work that I'm doing with the U.S. Attorney Generals, is the level of damage that this opioid pandemic has caused among the youth, in particular, in high schools. I didn't realize, how much of a problem it was spread nationwide. It's really not just, in lower socioeconomic kind of areas, but it's really widespread and even into more kind of middle, upper class communities. And I guess I didn't realize that. I didn't realize it was that much of an impact.
I have to admit, I didn't realize. I know the numbers are staggering, but until you can place context around them, for me at least, the numbers don't explain how bad it is. Yeah. So it's fascinating to me that you're saying that. My next question, what's something that made you happy over the last week?
Something that made me happy over the last week. Anything, personal, professional?
Anything. Yeah, absolutely, anything.
I would say over the last week, one of the things I've enjoyed, and it's great for me to do that because I'm always busy and traveling. I had a great day with my family, my children. I have 5 kids. I don't know that I have a lot of kids, and it's hard to get them to agree on doing one thing. And so I got them to agree over the weekend to go to a water park. I enjoy the water. Actually, all 5 of them agree in this park. My oldest is 17 and my youngest is 7. They don't always agree on wanting to do the same things. That was really fun for me. It was nice to see all 5 of the kids play and have fun. It was enjoyable.
That's really, really cool. I have to say, though, I didn't know you had 5 kids. I'm surprised none of them have interrupted any of our conversations. So kudos to you.
I'm surprised too. A lot of times you'll be surprised. They actually will knock on the door, and it's always like at the worst time. But they're pretty good. They know when I'm on call or something. So
good for them. And I have been flashing this throughout, but how can people reach you?
like you said, they can reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. You know, I'm always happy to get back to people, answer questions. If I can, anyone on the ACMA team is always happy to answer any questions about the board certification of medical affairs or any of the things that we do with the industry. You can also reach out to me at William at acmainfo.org as well. You see, Janine just did a comment there about my wife with efficacious. She's again, she's definitely my better half, but my wife Suzanne is, you know, she's someone that's very passionate about the area of pharmacy as well, and the role that, you know, women have played in pharmacy, especially over the last several decades, you know, in terms of how they've grown. I mean, I don't know if you know, but women in pharmacy now have become dominant, actually, and it's been great. It's been great. I think it's been good for the profession.
I thought they've been dominant for years, but I should probably ask to interview your wife at some point. That'd be really fun to have.
Yeah. Well, you know, the Pharmacy Mom is actually one of the, I think it is the largest online network of pharmacists in the country.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, apparently Janan's proud to be a pharmacist mom because of her.
Yeah, that's nice. Thank you, Jen. I'll have to tell her. I will definitely do a message.
This was amazing as always. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm looking forward to having you back again soon. So thank you everyone for listening, and stay tuned.
Yeah, thank you very much, Darshan. Always a pleasure.
Pleasure.
Thank you.